James had always made sure his son, Michael, had a nutritious homemade lunch to take to school every day. As a single father, he took pride in preparing meals that would keep his son healthy and energized. However, over the past few weeks, he started noticing something strange. Michael would come home ravenous, devouring whatever food was on the table as if he hadn't eaten all day. At first, James brushed it off, thinking it was just a normal phase. After all, Michael was growing, and boys his age often had an increased appetite. But as the days went by, James couldn't ignore the unsettling pattern. Every morning, he packed Michael's lunchbox carefully, making sure it was full of his favorite foods. Yet, when he checked Michael's backpack in the evening, the lunchbox was always empty. Was he eating everything at school? Or was something else going on? The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. One evening, after watching Michael inhale his dinner in record time, James decided to ask. "Michael," he said gently, trying not to sound too concerned, "are you eating your lunch at school?" Michael hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with something James couldn't quite place. Guilt? Worry? Then, he gave a small nod, but the way he avoided eye contact made James doubt his answer. Something wasn't right. James could feel it in his gut. And no matter how much he wanted to trust that everything was fine, a father's intuition told him otherwise. He needed to find out what was really going on. James had always believed he knew his son well. Michael was a bright, kind-hearted boy, never one to lie or keep secrets, or so James thought. But lately, something felt off. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. A slight hesitation when answering simple questions, a flicker of avoidance in his eyes whenever James asked about school, and the way he rushed to change the subject whenever lunchtime was mentioned. It wasn't just teenage mood swings, this was different. At first, James dismissed it as nothing more than stress from school. Maybe Michael was overwhelmed with homework or dealing with a small conflict with his friends. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. There was something Michael wasn't telling him, and James couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, as Michael came home from school and placed his backpack near the door, James watched him carefully. He noticed how his son moved, casual, yet a little too deliberate. There was an odd nervousness in his actions, as if he was aware of being observed. James decided he needed to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, while preparing Michael's lunch, James came up with a plan. He packed the usual, Michael's favorite turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a granola bar. Then, almost as an afterthought, he grabbed a permanent marker from the counter and carefully made a tiny mark on the bottom of the lunchbox, small enough that Michael wouldn't notice. If Michael was eating his lunch as usual, then the lunchbox would return with at least some crumbs, a wrapper, or a juice stain. But if something else was happening, James would have proof. That evening, when Michael returned home, James paid close attention. His son walked in, greeted him with the same familiar smile, and set his backpack down before heading off to wash his hands. James could tell something was off. The way Michael avoided his gaze, the way he seemed a little too relaxed, it was as if he was forcing himself to act normal. The moment Michael was out of sight, James seized the opportunity. He quickly unzipped the backpack, reached inside, and pulled out the lunchbox. His breath caught in his throat. It was completely empty. Not just empty of food, but utterly spotless, too clean. There were no crumbs, no wrappers, not even the faintest smear of peanut butter or jam. It looked as if it had never been used at all. James felt a strange mix of emotions, confusion, concern, and the undeniable sense that his son was hiding something. If Michael had eaten his lunch, there would at least be some evidence. But this was intentional. He wasn't just eating everything, he was making sure no trace was left behind. Why? James's mind raced with possibilities. Was Michael giving his lunch away? If so, to whom? And why wouldn't he just tell his father? Was someone taking it from him? The thought made James's stomach tighten. He carefully placed the lunchbox back where he found it, making sure everything looked untouched. If Michael was keeping a secret, James knew better than to confront him outright, at least, not yet. He needed more information. One thing was clear, something was going on, and James wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. James couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something was off with Michael. His son had been distant lately, quieter than usual, his bright, easygoing nature replaced by an unsettling nervousness. He barely touched his dinner, avoided eye contact, and had started taking his lunchbox to school every day, only to return with it completely empty. At first, James thought maybe Michael had simply been hungrier than usual, but something didn't add up. The portions James packed were generous, and Michael had never been one to overeat. More importantly, when James casually asked about lunch, Michael hesitated, just for a split second, before mumbling a vague response and quickly changing the subject. James knew his son. He recognized that hesitation. It was the kind that only came when Michael was hiding something. That realization settled uncomfortably in his chest, and he knew he had to get to the bottom of it. The next day, James made a decision. After dropping Michael off at school, he didn't drive away like usual. Instead, he parked a few blocks down the street and waited. His fingers tapped anxiously against the steering wheel as he watched students filter into the building. The morning passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. He kept glancing at the clock, waiting for lunchtime to arrive. Then, at exactly 12:10 p.m., the school doors swung open, and James spotted Michael stepping outside. His son held his lunchbox tightly, his posture tense, his eyes darting around as if making sure no one was watching him. James frowned. This wasn't normal behavior. Michael didn't head toward the cafeteria or the picnic tables where his friends usually gathered. Instead, he moved toward the far end of the schoolyard, his pace cautious yet purposeful. James sat up straighter, his breath hitching. Then, out of the shadows near the fence, a figure emerged. It was another boy, taller and leaner than Michael, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. His stance was stiff, wary, almost predatory. James' grip on the steering wheel tightened as he watched Michael slow to a stop in front of the boy. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. Then, hesitantly, Michael lifted his lunchbox and handed it over. The hooded boy took it without a word. He flipped it open, scanning the contents with a critical eye. After a moment, he gave a small nod of approval and snapped the box shut before tucking it under his arm. James' heart pounded. Why was Michael giving this boy his lunch? Who was he? And more importantly, was Michael in trouble? Michael stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, shoulders drawn tight. Even from a distance, James could see the way his son's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. Then, the boy said something, too quiet for James to hear, before turning on his heel and disappearing behind the trees. Michael lingered for a moment, exhaling shakily, before glancing around once more and hurriedly heading back toward the school building. James slumped back in his seat, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a missing lunch anymore. This was something much, much bigger. And whatever it was, his son was in the middle of it. James had spent the entire day in turmoil, his mind racing with questions. The strange behavior of Michael, the subtle shifts in his son's personality, and the bizarre incident with the missing lunches, it all seemed to point to something far more sinister than he had initially imagined. What was really going on? Why had Michael been so evasive? And who could be behind the mysterious disappearance of his food? His suspicions gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. It was too much to ignore any longer, and as the night settled in, he made up his mind. He was going to find answers. When the house grew quiet, and Michael had retreated to his room for the night, James quietly approached his son's backpack. His hands felt clammy as he hovered over it, guilt creeping in. He hated the idea of snooping through Michael's belongings. It felt like a violation of trust, but the sense of dread in his gut told him he had no choice. Something wasn't right, and he needed to get to the bottom of it, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. He carefully opened the zipper, and his fingers sifted through the scattered papers, books, and notebooks, feeling his pulse quicken. There was nothing unusual at first glance, just the clutter of a typical school bag. But something told him to look deeper, to dig a little further. At the very bottom, wedged beneath a thick textbook, James's fingers brushed against something that felt out of place. It was an envelope, small, crumpled, and tucked so far into the corner that he might have missed it entirely if he hadn't been so meticulous. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled it out, the paper fragile between his fingertips. His hands were trembling as he unfolded the envelope. Inside, there was a note, hastily scribbled in uneven handwriting that seemed to tremble on the edges of the paper. "You know what will happen if you don't bring it tomorrow. Don't tell anyone." James felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath him. His throat tightened, and his pulse began to race. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. The note was a threat, a warning. Someone was blackmailing his son, forcing him to do something against his will. The lunch that had gone missing over the past few days wasn't just a coincidence, it was part of something much darker. But who would do this to Michael? And why? Before he could fully process the overwhelming surge of emotions, a soft voice broke the silence of the room. "Dad, what are you doing?" James froze, heart leaping into his throat. He turned quickly, his breath catching when he saw Michael standing in the doorway. His son's face was pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. His figure, usually so confident, seemed smaller now, almost fragile under the weight of the situation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. James's mind was racing, desperately trying to decide what to do next. The note in his hands felt heavy, like a ticking bomb. It was clear that Michael knew more than he had let on. He couldn't hide the truth any longer. James's voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of a father's worry. "Michael, who gave you this?" He held up the note, his fingers trembling with urgency. Michael's eyes flickered to the paper, his expression shifting from shock to something else, something like shame. He opened his mouth but closed it again, as if the words were stuck, unable to come out. His small frame seemed to shrink under the pressure of the moment. James's heart ached as he watched his son struggle. The fear was palpable in the air between them. He wasn't angry, not yet. All he felt was an overwhelming need to protect Michael, to shield him from whatever was going on. He took a step closer, his voice softening. "Son, you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever it is, you can tell me. You're not in trouble. Just, please, tell me what's happening." Michael's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down, swallowing hard. The silence in the room seemed to stretch for what felt like an eternity, before Michael finally spoke in a barely audible whisper. "It's not just my lunch they want, Dad." James felt as though the world had tilted beneath him. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth. It wasn't just food. This was about something bigger, something more sinister, and his mind struggled to grasp the reality of it all. His protective instincts kicked into overdrive, his heart pounding as the fear for his son bubbled to the surface. "Michael, what are you talking about?" James asked, his voice shaking. "What are they asking for?" Michael closed his eyes, tears spilling over, his voice quivering. "It's my homework, Dad. They want me to give them the answers. They said if I don't, they'll hurt me." James's world crumbled. His son, just a child, was being bullied into helping someone cheat. The fear and anxiety that had consumed him over the past few days had only been a fraction of the true horror Michael had been enduring. The lunch, the note, it all made sense now, but it was worse than he had ever imagined. James's mind raced, flooded with anger and confusion. Who would do something like this to a child? His instincts told him to act quickly, to protect Michael from the looming threat. But how? His gaze softened as he reached out to Michael, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I won't let anyone hurt you. I promise." But as he held his son, he knew the fight was just beginning. The enemy was out there, lurking in the shadows, and he would do whatever it took to protect his boy from whatever horrors lay ahead. Michael sat motionless on his bed, his heart hammering in his chest as if it might explode. The note James had found was still in his father's hands, the cruel words scrawled across it like a scar on his soul. Each sentence felt like a weight, pulling him deeper into the suffocating grip of fear. He could feel his hands shaking, the cold sweat that had already soaked through his shirt. His eyes darted anxiously around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. His world, once so familiar and safe, now felt like a maze of shadows and unknown threats. He hadn't told anyone about the fear gnawing at him for weeks, maybe even longer. Every day, he had tried to act normal, pretending everything was fine, even though the threat hanging over him never let go. It was hard to explain it to himself, let alone to anyone else. How could he admit that he was being manipulated, controlled, by people whose faces he didn't even know? The silence in his room was deafening as his mind raced, replaying every moment, every encounter, trying to make sense of it all. How had he gotten here? How had his life turned into this? The fear was all-consuming, wrapping itself around him like chains. It had started small, an anonymous message, a warning in the middle of the night. But then, it had escalated. The notes, the phone calls, the threats to his family, and now, this. His stomach twisted into knots. They knew everything. They knew about his father, about his life, about everything that mattered. The people behind this, whoever they were playing a game, and Michael was just a pawn, trapped in a corner with no way out. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. He hadn't wanted to tell his father, not because he didn't trust him, but because he couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes. And yet, here they were. The truth was spilling out, whether he was ready for it or not. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had wanted to protect his father, to shield him from the terrifying reality he was now living in. But the weight of it all was too much to carry alone anymore. James stood silently, watching his son, his heart aching as he saw the fear etched on Michael's face. He had known something was wrong. He had seen the subtle changes in Michael over the past few weeks, the way he had withdrawn, how he had grown more anxious and distant. But this was a depth of fear he had never seen in his son before. Michael's eyes were wide with panic, his body rigid, as though every sound around him threatened to snap him into a state of terror. "Michael," James said softly, his voice cracking slightly. He knelt in front of him, his hands reaching out, wanting to comfort, wanting to shield him from the nightmare he knew Michael was living. "I need you to listen to me. You're not alone in this. You're safe now. Please, tell me what's been happening. I need to know, for you, for us." Michael's breathing was shallow, each inhale and exhale coming in rapid succession as he struggled to find the words. His chest felt heavy, suffocating, like he couldn't breathe properly. His hands were clammy, his fingers twisted into the fabric of his pants as he tried to gather the strength to speak. He wanted to tell his father everything, to share the burden of his fear, but a voice inside him screamed not to. They had made it clear, if he spoke out, if he told anyone, the consequences would be worse. "Dad." Michael's voice faltered, and he swallowed hard. His eyes filled with tears, but he refused to let them fall. "I didn't want to tell you. I thought I could handle it. I thought, if I just kept doing what they said, it would stop. But it's not stopping. And I'm scared. They said if I tell you, they'll hurt you. They'll hurt us both." His voice broke on the last word, and he hung his head, unable to meet his father's eyes. James's heart tightened as he absorbed the magnitude of Michael's words. He had suspected something, but hearing the truth, his son, terrified, manipulated, and controlled by people he didn't even know, it was more than he could bear. His instincts screamed to hold Michael, to protect him from this unseen enemy. But he couldn't show weakness now. Michael needed him to be strong, to be the father who could keep him safe. And James wasn't going to fail him. With a deep, steadying breath, James placed his hands on Michael's shoulders, lifting his son's gaze to meet his. There was no room for doubt now. James's voice was firm, resolute, a deep determination cutting through the fear that had held him back until now. "Michael, look at me," he said, his tone unwavering. "I don't care who they are, what they've said, or what they think they can do. I will protect you. Do you hear me? No one is going to hurt you. Not on my watch. We're in this together, and we'll get through it together. But you need to trust me. You need to tell me everything, no more secrets, no more lies. We're going to end this. We're going to find out who's behind all of this, and we'll make sure they never threaten you again. Michael's eyes softened slightly, his lips trembling as he finally allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that his father's words could be true. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he didn't have to carry this alone anymore. I'm sorry, Dad, Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. I was just so scared. James shook his head, pulling his son into a tight embrace. There's nothing to apologize for, Michael. You've been through hell, and it's not your fault. We're going to take it from here. You've been brave, but you don't have to do this alone anymore. I've got you. With those words, a sense of peace began to settle over Michael. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The fear didn't disappear, but it felt a little smaller, a little more manageable now that his father was there, standing firm by his side. James stood up, a fire burning in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision he was about to make pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. He couldn't let his son live in fear any longer. His every instinct screamed that it was time to act, time to find the people who had been tormenting Michael, to make them pay for what they had done. I'm not wasting any more time, James muttered under his breath. We'll make sure they never hurt you again, Michael. I promise you that. With newfound determination, James left the room, his mind already working through the next steps. He couldn't let fear hold him back. For his son, he would fight this war, and he would not rest until Michael was free from the invisible chains that had bound him for so long. The air felt thick with tension as James paced the dimly lit hallway. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a drum of urgency. The decision was made, he was not going to let his son suffer any longer. The people who had tormented Michael, hidden in the shadows, controlling his every move with threats and fear, were about to meet the full force of justice. James had always been a man of patience, but now, there was no room for caution. His son's pain had ignited a fire within him, one that could not be extinguished until the perpetrators were brought to justice. James reached the front door, his fingers hovering over the handle. He paused for a moment, taking in a steadying breath. The time for hesitation was over. He was about to confront the people who had dared to harm his family. They would not get away with this. He opened the door slowly, stepping into the cold night, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Michael sat in the living room, his hands trembling in his lap. His father's words had given him a small flicker of hope, but that hope came with its own kind of fear. What if things didn't go the way they planned? What if they couldn't find the people behind all of this? What if his father's bravery wasn't enough to protect them both? But as the front door creaked open and James stepped back inside, something in Michael shifted. His father's determined expression, the firmness in his step, it was as if a quiet promise lingered in the air. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Michael, James said, his voice low but strong, filled with an intensity that brooked no argument. We've found them. It's time to end this. Michael looked up, his heart racing once again. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that even saying it aloud might shatter the fragile resolve he had built. We go to them, James replied firmly, his eyes dark with resolve. We confront them head-on. It's the only way we can ensure they don't hurt anyone else. The car ride to their destination was silent, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white against the dark leather. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when his son was counting on him. As they reached the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, the fear and adrenaline began to churn inside James like a storm ready to break. He had always told Michael that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And now, as he stood at the threshold of danger, those words echoed in his mind. The doors to the warehouse were rusted and barely hanging on their hinges. James and Michael approached cautiously, each step echoing in the cold night air. James glanced at Michael, his eyes filled with quiet reassurance. "Stay close," he murmured. "We'll do this together." Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and shadows. There was no sign of movement at first, but James could feel the weight of eyes on him, watching from the dark. His pulse quickened. He could hear faint whispers, low voices that seemed to drift through the air like smoke. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was one of them, one of the people who had tormented Michael. The man's face was hidden in the shadows, but his presence was unmistakable. He stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You came," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think you can stop us? You think you can bring justice to something that's already too far gone?" James's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched. "You've hurt my son," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "And for that, you'll answer." The man chuckled darkly. "Answer? To you? You don't understand, do you? This was never about your son. This was about control, power. You can't stop it. You can't stop us." James took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "I don't care about your games. I care about my son's safety. And you're going to pay for everything you've done." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men locked eyes. James stood his ground, his body tense and ready for whatever came next. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. This was the moment when the scales of justice tipped, and he would not let it slip through his fingers. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the warehouse, and two more figures emerged, their faces obscured by hoods. They flanked the first man, and for a brief moment, the odds seemed stacked against them. But James wasn't backing down. He had come too far. "I'm done playing your game," James said, his voice firm, his eyes burning with determination. "You've made a mistake thinking you could intimidate me, or my son. You've made a mistake thinking you could get away with this." A gun appeared in the man's hand, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was at stake now. His father was not just risking his safety, but everything. The threat hung in the air, but James didn't flinch. "You want to threaten us?" James asked, his voice sharp. "Do it. But know this, when it's all over, it won't be your guns that save you. It'll be justice. And justice always finds a way." Before the man could react, James lunged forward, grabbing the gun and wrestling it from his grip. The tension snapped, and a fight broke out, chaotic, fast, and brutal. But through it all, James kept his focus on the prize, his son's safety. The warehouse was filled with shouts, the sound of fists meeting flesh, but James kept his head. He was fighting for something more than his own life now. Minutes later, the fight was over. The men lay on the floor, subdued and helpless. James stood over them, panting, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. Michael stood behind him, watching his father with awe and gratitude. "Are you okay?" James asked, turning to Michael, his voice soft despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Michael nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief at what had just happened. "I'm fine, Dad. You saved us." James smiled faintly, his heart swelling with pride. "We saved each other. And that's what matters." In the end, justice had been served. It wasn't just about the victory, it was about the message. No matter the darkness, no matter the threat, there was always light. And in that moment, standing side by side, James and Michael knew they had won not only the battle but the peace that would come with it.